To see such a full house. My role is to set out the legal background to selective licensing, to outline what we know about the proposal that Newham Council is putting forward so far, to pose some questions that we believe need to be answered to show that this is a justifiable course of action, and to ask if there are some more effective ways of addressing the same objectives. So let's start just by looking at the legal background. Selective licensing is a power created under the Housing Act 2004, and if an area is designated as an area subject to selective licensing, all private rented sector properties in that area must have a licence. It's a criminal offence not to hold one, which is punishable by a fine of up to £20,000 and confiscation of the management of the property on conviction. Any breach of the licence conditions is punishable by a fine of up to £5,000 per time. And perhaps most significantly for landlords, an unlicensed landlord cannot rely on a Section 21 notice. So just wait while the bin men finish. Nice to know the council services are working well. Figure this out. So it's a targeted measure to deal with a specific problem. And to demonstrate that it is dealing with a specific problem, it has to comply with some strict legal criteria. First, it has to show that it is addressing one of two requirements. It could be to deal with an area of low housing demand. What do we mean by low housing demand? Well, the government guidance says that it must demonstrate that the value of properties are reducing. That there is a high turnover of occupiers in both the owner-occupied and the private rented sector. There's a high number of properties available, and there are many empty properties. There may also be consideration of whether the market demand is now dominated by one tenure, or if facilities such as local shops are rapidly closing. The government guidance does make clear that it's not a protective measure. The area has to be changing, and that change is expected to be continuing. The other requirement could be to deal with a persistent and significant problem with antisocial behaviour. And that could relate to crime, burglary, vandalism, that kind, begging, prostitution, drugs or alcohol-related offences, nuisance neighbours, or environmental crimes such as graffiti, fly tipping, fly posting. But if the application is going to be on the grounds of persistent and significant problem with antisocial behaviour, then it needs to demonstrate the link between the antisocial behaviour and the private rented sector. Local authorities also have to demonstrate that other courses of action have been considered, that they've thought or looked at whether there's an effective alternative, and they've considered how this works as part of the other strategies they have in terms of homelessness, housing, regeneration, so on and so forth. They've also having looked at those other courses of action, they have to be clear that they are not as effective as selective licensing. So selective licensing has to demonstrate that it will improve. They have to show how it will work alongside some of those other measures that I referred to a moment ago, and they have to consider the role of other partners such as the police and social services. And they have to demonstrate, the council has to demonstrate that the designation will significantly assist in solving the problem. And that needs to also take into account the possible consequences of designating an area as an area for selective licensing, whether that will simply move the problem just outside the area, what other effects it might have, and what implications it will have for the council's enforcement resources. Now, we understand that full details of the proposal for selective licensing will be made available shortly. There's a consultation in train at the moment. It's an online consultation, which is essentially an opinion survey rather than an attempt to gather empirical data, and that closes on the 4th of December. What we can gather from that is the proposal is that every private rent sector property in the whole of the borough of Newham will be licensed. The fee will be £300, reduced to £150 if the landlord is an accredited landlord, but increased to £500 if accredited late, or £1,000 if it is only accredited only licensed after the after enforcement action. We're not sure yet whether those fees apply annually or to the whole period of the scheme, it's 5 years, and obviously that makes a significant difference. We also know from the survey that additional licensing, which is a separate measure, is also being considered if the decision is made not to go ahead with selective licensing. We're told full details and evidence will be provided later, and there will be a second consultation in early 2012. As I said, selective licensing is intended as a targeted measure. So the first question I want to ask is a borough-wide designation selective? Can designating a whole borough be considered selective? Of the 17 active selective licensing schemes we know of in England at the moment, this will be the largest by some distance. The largest we know of so far is in Thanet, which covers 2 council wards. Newham already has one active scheme in the Little Elford area, and we in the NLA looked quite carefully at that proposal when it was first made, and came to the conclusion that it was an appropriate use of powers, which was one of the reasons why we didn't oppose it at the time. Generally, we are not in favour of the creation of wide area schemes because, by the nature, it is selective licensing. It's a rapier rather than a cutlass. So, again, the question I would ask is, why the whole borough? How selective is that approach? I think also to ask, is the Little Ilford Neighbourhood Improvement Zone considered a success? It's been running 18 months now, so I'm sure there must be some evidence coming back from that. If it is a success, why is that? What other measures have been used in parallel with that? And what are the lessons that are drawn from that, and how are they informing the proposal going forward? Again, as we understand it, the basis for the scheme is antisocial behaviour, and the consultation refers to problems in some properties in the private rented sector. Now, again, the question I would like to ask is, if there are problems in some properties in the private rented sector, how does that then translate into there being a significant and persistent problem in the private rented sector across Newham? The government guidance on implementing a selective licensing scheme says that this measure is specifically not for tackling individual antisocial behaviour problems. There are more appropriate measures to do that. So we have to ask, is the PRS, its private rented sector, actually the issue? Is this introducing housing restrictions the right course of action? Are there other causes? Has there been a failure of enforcement? Should there have been other council action that has contributed to this? What has been the role of the police in dealing with some of the antisocial behaviour? If there's a problem in private rented housing, is there a parallel problem in the social rented sector? And if so, what proposals are there to deal with that? Now, I think we're all agreed that we are all aiming, ultimately, for the same goals: to improve the private rented sector, to support the professional landlords, and by those I mean those who take a professional attitude, not necessarily those who are landlords full-time, and to make sure that enforcement action is taken against the rogue operators, because it's the rogues who bring down the reputation of everyone. So, what we want, if selective licensing is intended as the option of last resort, I'd like to ask, have alternatives been considered, and if so, why have they been rejected? Local authority does have extensive enforcement powers in relation to the private rented sector, the housing health and safety rating system, improvement notices, management orders. Have these been considered as targeted measures? Have they been used? Why are they thought to be insufficient? We're also quite concerned that selective licensing, and our experience having worked and looked at selective licensing in other areas, is that selective licensing can actually take time and money away from enforcement. It is very costly in terms of time and resources, and that is not always compensated by the fees that can be charged. In fact, we are aware of Swansea as an example, where in the first year of operation, the selective licensing actually cost the council £29,000 more than it brought in. So again, would targeted enforcement be more effective? Would we be able to identify the specific problems and work to improve those, rather than a blanket approach? So the question I think we need to understand is, has there been a cost-benefit analysis of the selective licensing approach as opposed to other more targeted approaches, and how has that come out to prove that selective licensing is the most effective use of authority time and council taxpayers' money? We believe in NLA we are very committed to accreditation. We've done a lot of work to encourage accreditation and to encourage that around developing the skills and the knowledge of landlords so they know how to manage their properties and how they can do that, manage their tenancies together. Education is the key to improving property and management standards, and we believe it's a much more effective approach than licensing.